Welcome to Vancouver Overcast with Mike Klassen. I am extremely pleased to have two guests on here today. Then we're going to talk about the never-ending struggle around affordable housing in Vancouver, in British Columbia. And I was really prompted by some communication that my two guests have recently posted on Twitter. And they became, it was just so tempting to really bring them together, even with their very varied experience and perspectives here, to really talk about this subject that just seems to be an endless amount of conversation, and maybe answer some questions for listeners and me as well, as to how we can really tackle this particular challenge that we face, which I think is really one of the major challenges of our time right now. So I'll begin by just asking my guests, Avi Barzilai, can you tell me a little bit about your experience and your background to our listeners here?
Yeah, I'll be Barzilai here with Barzilai Building. I'm a licensed residential builder, and most of my work is renovations in the city of Vancouver, and almost exclusively in the city of Vancouver. I've been in business for about 10 years, and I grew up in Vancouver. I've lived most of my life in the city. I've seen how the city's changed, and I really hope to bring a unique perspective from a younger builder to really show how kind of the city's moving in certain directions, and maybe have a unique perspective in that regard.
Thanks very much. Well, Michael Geller, for people who tune into this podcast, they probably are very familiar with you, but I'd like it if you talk a bit about you. I know that you worked at the Canadian Mortgage and Housing. You have been integral in huge projects such as University at SFU. You still are building projects, multi-family developments today. But maybe just give us a little bit of a sample of your background.
So I've been at this for 50 years, starting initially as an architect, then with 10 years with CMHC, during which time I was involved with the social housing projects built around the province. I was also the special coordinator for the redevelopment of the South Shore of False Creek, which has been in the news lately. In '81, I returned to Vancouver to join a private development company, NAROD, which at the time was a very active development and construction company. And in '83, 21% interest rates put us under, and I set up my own firm. And since then, I've been involved in planning and developing, both as a principal and as a consultant, a variety of residential and mixed-use projects.
Isn't it interesting now that we are having a 1983 experience in terms of inflation, although we're not quite at 1983 levels, I should point out, but we seem to be on track to be going there. And that's putting a whole new wrinkle on housing development as well, and the price of housing. So maybe I'll just start with a general question to both of you. Michael, your sort of really long experience, and then Avi, your kind of almost daily experience that you're going through right now. What role does municipal government play in terms of getting housing built? Michael, do you mind maybe want to start us off?
Well, if we think of 4 levels of government, and there are 4 levels of government. There's the municipal government, there's the federal government, there's the provincial government, but there's also the metro level of government that should not be ignored. I would say that overall, the municipal level of government is the one that's most directly involved in municipal approvals. And increasingly, we're seeing municipalities becoming more involved in trying to create more affordable housing, which historically was the domain of the federal and the provincial governments. But as Avi will tell you, I think in very great detail, on a day-to-day basis, if you want to get a project approved, whether it's in Vancouver or whether it's Surrey or Burnaby, it's the municipal government that you're dealing with. And whether or not you're in Vancouver or a municipality, the city council will get involved to varying degrees. In Vancouver, not as much as in other municipalities, where indeed some of the little renovations that Avi does, if he's in West Vancouver, he'd be showing up on Monday night at a council meeting trying to get approval for some of the things he's trying to do.
Avi, you've been in this business for the past 10 years. Has it changed over the last 10 years with regards to how you deal with the local government? And I'll start off just by framing this. I'm not interested in a finger pointing exercise, and I don't think any of you are. But it is helpful to understand how things have changed in terms of the requirements and also the pressures that local governments perhaps face in trying to meet this demand. Avi, can you give us a little take on how things have changed in your career?
Yeah, so I can speak to my own experience. I can also speak to other builders that have been in business for 20, 30 years. And I think the main thing that I can say is things, especially in terms of permit wait times, have gone from bad to worse. And I think for a lot of builders, there's just a sense of hopelessness that the system's ever going to get better. The city of Vancouver has, in my experience, and also talking to other builders, has a reputation for just having a very slow, arduous, onerous permit approval system. And I think, especially if you look at COVID and how that has impacted the last 2 years, it's just been almost twice as bad. I would say approvals over the course of the last 2 years have gone twice as bad. Everything's slow. A lot of staff are still working at home. And I think a lot of municipalities out there, from what I've heard, are dealing with similar things, although Vancouver seems to always be the one at the top of the pile that has the worst approval times.
Michael, you have dealt with lots of local governments. How have you seen things change over the course of the last several years? I'm not sure how much work you're doing in Vancouver proper today, but maybe you can contrast what's going on in some other cities as well.
You know, it's hard to generalize because to some degree, you have to talk about the type of project and the municipality. But I would say, generally speaking, we're seeing different attitudes today than we saw 10 years ago towards different types of development and densification. In some respects, I would like to think that the attitude towards, say, developing multifamily housing in a single family neighborhood have got better. There seems to be a greater acceptance of, say, apartments in Kerrisdale or Dunbar or Point Grey or the East Side than there was 10 years ago. But that said, some of the other larger scale developments are meeting greater resistance. And indeed, the densities, and by density, I mean the floor space ratio, the area of a building in relation to the land. Whereas before we would talk about 1 or 1.5 as a ratio, today we're actually talking about 10 times that in some instances. And that's what's beginning to attract a lot of attention. But the other thing that I think has changed to some degree is the sense that we're now facing an affordability crisis, a very, very urgent crisis. Although, to be fair, that has been a topic of concern since long before Avi was even born.
I'm going to continue with you, Michael. You mentioned density, and I've seen some of the comments that you've made. Our friend Frank Ducote, as well, former planner at the City of Vancouver, sometimes like to weigh in a little bit on Twitter and some of these discussions, specifically about the FSR of some projects. You've been critical of some that have already been approved on Broadway. I wonder what's the difference between a 14 and a 19-story building, and why adding that additional FSR is such a trigger for people in your business, but also people on the ground. It seems to me that, and I've heard it explained this way, by doing that tower over there, you get to keep your single family home over there. And there doesn't seem to be that connection. People get very emotionally tied up, particularly in the city. We're seeing quite the contrast in Burnaby and Surrey and Coquitlam, where they're building very tall towers. Um, Talk to me a little bit about that density, that height, and why that matters so much.
So the first thing is, you quite correctly have pointed out there are two components to building. And if I could use an analogy, which will no doubt get me into trouble, when we talk about people, we sometimes talk about their size in terms of their height, but also in terms of their weight. And if you like, the number of floors in the building is generally the reference to the height, but the floor space ratio is in effect a reference to their weight. And in many respects, I am sometimes more concerned, and I think other planners are concerned about the weight of a building as much as its height, because the weight becomes a function of how much does it block views, how much does it cast shadows, and so forth. There's no doubt that many people say to me, look, does it really matter if a building is 14 stories or 18 stories tall? And I have to admit, probably in many instances, it does not. But when they ask, does it make a difference whether it's 14 stories or 40 stories tall? I think it can make a difference, especially when it's adjacent to 2- and 3-story buildings. And I think that's part of the challenge that many of us, at least in my line of work, are facing these days.
Is that because we need to kind of graduate up to that height? Are we saying that someday we never are going to have 40-story towers in some of these neighborhoods? It seems to me that as time evolves, that just becomes a recognized fact.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And there are a number of people who've challenged me by saying, look, the trouble with people of my age is we keep looking at things as if they were how they existed 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. And there's no doubt that what's being proposed today is dramatically different. But I remember many years ago an interview with Arthur Erickson on the radio, and they were asking him, how does he design a building? And he said, when I design a building, it's important to look at what's there beside it. And I should somehow relate to that in some way. And the interviewer said, yes, but in years to come, buildings are going to be much bigger. And Erickson said, absolutely right. And in the future, someone will look at my building and then relate that building. And indeed, there's a concept of zoning that we never talk about, Mike, which is called dynamic zoning, which is a zoning bylaw that actually looks at incremental change over time. And to some degree, I think something like that is a much more rational approach. And indeed, the 20-story buildings that I might be concerned about today will be absolutely fine in 20 years. But we need to reflect the fact that these changes should occur incrementally.
Yeah, can I just jump in there?
Yeah, go ahead.
I do actually agree with Michael in terms of incremental change fundamentally. I think the problem is publicly what people see is they see a lot of people that the same people that are against massive change are also against incremental change. And the city of Vancouver, I mean, you see a clear dividing line between East Vancouver and West Vancouver. So East Vancouver tends to be sort of more pro-development. There's not as much opposition to larger buildings. West Side rather seems to be much more in opposition. And I think a lot of groups out there on the West Side aren't necessarily just against massive density, they're against incremental density as well. So I think from the public's perspective, they continually see a lot of opposition to things like the Broadway corridor and that sort of thing. But the opposition is the same opposition to any kind of change, any kind of incremental or even small scale like townhouses or infill or anything. The same types of people are against that. So I think there's maybe just a bit of fatigue on people, on the pro-density people, that they just feel like even incremental change will just get sort of voted down as well.
Before we go on, I think Avi's raised an interesting point, and that is people are concerned about the physical change. But I often hear that many people are saying it's not the physical change that they're concerned about, it's the population change. that, we've historically heard people oppose rental housing because that brings a different type of person into a community than a condominium development. And at some point, I think that is worth discussing. Although I must admit, I tend not to agree with those who believe that a lot of these changes are motivated by class distinction or racially motivated. I think more often people just don't like having a very big, large building right next door to their house. And I think sometimes it's as simple as that.
Hard to get around the fact that you've got a large building. I mean, you'll be able there seeing it every day. But the fact is that over time, as we say, time seems to heal all wounds when it comes to any kind of anxiety around housing. Large density housing, it seems like we become accustomed to it. There are tall buildings that are on the west side. Not many of them. They're a little bit more spread out, and I'm sure they were very controversial in their time when they went up. But nobody complains about that. Some of those towers that you see in Kitsilano, for example, near
And the West End, sure. I mean, one of the most affordable places in the city of Vancouver is the West End, Vancouver, and many people would argue that's one of the best neighborhoods in the world. And the same kind of opposition that you see today in the Broadway corridor, justified or not, is happen with the West End. So I think we really need to look 30, 40 years in the future instead of just the individual that's getting their view obscured or maybe some shadowing or that sort of thing.
There's a quite a provocative planner and commentator named James Kunstler, and he's once said in an interview I heard is that if you like view so much, then knock all the buildings down, right? Flatten everything to the ground. A bit of a jaded view, but I think it was his way of saying, guys, we have to accept the fact that the cityscape is changing. I just want to stay on this topic a little bit about the frustration or the opposition. I want to just ask a simple question. Is it social media that's really become the driver of this? The fact that everybody can hide or present themselves onto platforms like Twitter and elsewhere, or organize a group, an opposition group through Facebook, that we've become so intensified in terms of that debate and the resistance. Michael, I know you're on there all the time, and I'll get you to answer the question as well.
I would suggest that social media, if anything, hasn't so much solidified the opposition as solidified the other side. In other words, the abundant housing, the YIMBY sentiment, which really didn't exist 10 years ago. To my mind, that's becoming solidified. The support for projects is much greater today than it was 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. And I would attribute that to social media.
I agree that that's what's going on, but Avi, aren't we sort of still experiencing a bit of a cage match online when it comes to people who are posting up pictures of rows and rows of towers going down Broadway and saying, look, this is what it's going to be, it's going to look like?
Yeah, no, I agree with Michael 100%. It's a cage match, but one side is a lot bigger and more ferocious than the other, and that side is more savvy when it comes to social media, because I think the fact of the matter is a lot of the sources that are more pro development and pro density nowadays are younger people. And they're just going to be more social media savvy. So in that sense, 100%, I agree with Michael that in terms of the yes and my, if you can kind of divide it into those simple terms, the yes in my backyard lobby definitely has a much stronger voice on social media than the not in my backyard. Although I will say one of the main differences, the not in my backyard lobby will generally go and speak before council more from what I've seen, although that I think is also starting to change.
I want to just talk about for a second, and it's a little bit unusual, but there was a panel presentation that happened this week, hosted by Vancouver Sun. It brought in the Minister of Housing, David Eby, Bob Rennie, well-known real estate marketer and developer, Joy McPhail, who was the chair of the Open Doors report, and Burnt Christmas, who is a First Nations representative working with the MST project in Jericho lands, as far as I remember. And it was, I thought, a very interesting discussion, but I also thought that their context was a little bit different than the one that we have here. Jerry McPhail, as I recall, was very damning in terms of her comments about community amenity contributions. Talk about that for a second, why she thinks that they're a bad idea and we should change things. Minister Eby, he defended the approach that they've taken in terms of foreign buyers tax, in terms of speculation tax, in terms of rent controls and what have you. But he's obviously being prompted as to what he's prepared to do from a legislative standpoint in terms of any kind of changes to make housing more construction happen more quickly. And then, of course, Bob Rennie had some interesting comments, as always. He's a very colorful and insightful speaker, but he is held the view that we need to continue to build. We need to have councils that are prepared to do the support that kind of building and so on. I mean, he's always been a very market-driven focus in his take on things. Avi, you were listening to the discussion as well, and you also posed a question online. What was your thoughts about what you heard from the panel last night?
So I didn't actually get a chance to hear it. I did post the question. I'm not sure if it was answered, but I think it is interesting to note when it comes to our housing minister, David Eby, just how one singular person well placed in government can have such an outsized impact. And I think he's one of those individuals, and I think he's also just getting started. Because as I understand it, when it comes to the Broadway corridor, a lot of the pressure to develop the Broadway corridor comes directly from him. I mean, fundamentally, he's saying, well, if you want this funding for the Broadway line, then you're going to have to increase density. And obviously, like, there's lots of other factors too, but there's a ton of pressure from him. And he's sort of acting like the bad cop these days and really putting a lot of pressure on municipalities, saying, if you guys don't smarten up, then we're really going to step in. And I would welcome that, regulating, for me personally, just regulatory approval and permit wait times. And to be honest, I'll bet you a lot of councils would welcome it too, because it sort of takes the decision out of their hands, and then they're not the bad guys. They're not the ones that are going to be punished by voters. So yeah, I think there's really, our Minister of Housing can really have an outside impact, or just a massive impact here.
Michael, you're not unfamiliar with what the minister said in the past, and as well as Bob Rennie. What's your sort of take on their approach to this conversation?
Well, just picking up on what Avi said, which I agree with, when you asked the first question, who really has the responsibility to approve projects, I said it's the municipalities. If I was to restate that, I would say it's the municipalities, unless the provincial minister of housing thinks they're taking too long, in which case he may have the ultimate say, because indeed, for the first time in many, many years, we do have a minister of housing who I think happens to be an extremely bright guy, saying it's absurd the amount of time. I mean, we don't talk about months, we talk about years to get approval for things that should be done in weeks. And it's not, I mean, even when they sometimes all think it's a good project, it takes months and years, and it's absurd. And when I wrote a column for the Courier, I was constantly approached from people who were trying to do the types of projects that Avi's involved with, renovating a heritage house, adding a coach house, and they couldn't believe how long and difficult it was to do it. And I think Eby, to his credit, is saying, it's time to completely rethink this whole process. And I agree with Avi that I think he is going to have some impact, and he is going to make it easier for some municipalities, because the politicians, especially when they're facing re-election, they would love to say, look, I had concerns about this triplex in your neighborhood, But the provincial government made it clear that we had to meet our housing targets to accommodate a greater number of people and to create more affordable housing for people who work in our communities. And therefore, I had no choice but to approve that project. Or indeed, that's why they approved it, because ultimately we could get to that. In other provinces, those people who aren't familiar with Ontario, they have something there called the Ontario Municipal Board, which is a kind of court of appeal where so many decisions of the municipalities are then taken to a higher level. I don't want to see that happen here, but I do think we need to rationalize the process, because it is absurd right now how long it takes to get approvals.
For those who are listening who don't know the area that we're talking about, the Broadway corridor, as it's called, is you know, as for as long as I've lived here, has been dubbed the second downtown of Vancouver. It is a highly concentrated area with a lot of business activity and a lot of already a fair bit of density, but they want to extend that out to UBC. I would say that Minister Eby has some very interesting sort of political space to deal with, because first of all, those major developments that are will be sort of wrapped around that increased density in that transit corridor are by the First Nations, and the First Nations, including the MST, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, who are jointly working on the project in the Jericho lands, and as well the Senac development, which is in Kitts Point, is going to that work's going to happen very quickly, and it's going to happen. It's going to give an incentive to make sure that that transit corridor, which they want to put, which they're already digging for SkyTrain to go underneath there, they have to find a way to rationalize that expenditure ultimately, which is going to go all the way out to UBC. It's clear that that's where it'll ultimately go. It was actually the previous MLA for Vancouver Point Grey, Gordon Campbell, during his re-election campaign in 2009, as I recall, was the first one to talk about SkyTrain out to UBC. And here we are, 14 years later almost, and it's only starting to come into reality. I want to just talk a little bit of, because we set this up as a conversation around housing affordability, and I think there are some really important things going on. Inflation, certainly we can talk about in a moment, in the cost of building materials, labor, and what have you. But we've had inflation of a kind in our marketplace for the last 20 years, certainly where there was an incredible graphic that was shown during last night, or the presentation with Minister Eby, to show that the highest cost increase for housing of all OECD countries has been in Canada over that period of the mid 2000s to today. Huge increase of 168, almost 200%. Something has happened where that is driving that here, and I want maybe your both perspectives on why are we now, what are those things that are really driving up that high cost of housing here, and can we ever get a handle on it? Michael, do you want to kick off that conversation?
I often have conversations with people about the cost of housing, and they talk about the cost of land, and the cost of land is significant. Indeed, at times, the cost of land is greater than the cost of actually building what we call the hard costs of building a residential unit or a home. But there are other costs. There's what we call the soft costs. And by soft costs, I'm really referring to the consultants' fees, the interest, the property taxes, but also all the municipal fees. And as many people have pointed out, the municipal fees can be very, very significant in terms of the percentage of the cost of housing. In addition to that, we have the financing costs. Now, when I first got into this business, the financing costs were sometimes almost as much as the hard costs, or certainly the architect's costs. But in the last 10, 15 years, financing costs have been relatively insignificant, but that's changing right now, and that's important. The other considerations, of course, are marketing costs, and those people buying new condos, well, the marketing costs may not be as great as for that timeshare unit you bought while you were on holiday in Las Vegas. Marketing costs can approach 7 or 8% of the sales price of a unit when you add in the realtors and all of the presentation centers and so forth. And then there's the developer's profit. And many people would say to me, look, why do you developers need such a high profit? Like, why don't you work for 5% instead of 15%? And I say, because the bank won't finance a project unless we can show them that we're hopefully going to get 15%, even though in many instances we may not. So in other words, there's a number of different cost components, and they all have different levels of significance at different points in time. But the sad irony is the cost that Avi deals with every day, generally the cost of construction, relatively speaking, that has not been that significant until recently. And when I say that, Navi can take over the last year, we've experienced about a 21% increase in the cost of construction. Indeed, over the last 3 or 4 months, we've increased costs. But Avi can speak better to that than I can.
Avi.
Yeah, I mean, definitely on the subject of construction costs, I did that Twitter thread about construction costs in the city of Vancouver, and it's just a never-ending, 1-2 punch, one after the other. In this, definitely in the city of Vancouver, but I think around the world, really doesn't matter what you do. COVID's kind of impacted construction throughout. So, I mean, a few examples we're dealing with right now is for the last few months, we haven't been able to get 4-inch PVC pipe. Now, if you don't work in construction, just so you know, you need 4-inch PVC pipe to do the drainage in every single building that exists. And because construction is very linear, if you don't have that one component, then construction stops. And that's the case with every product. There's a shortage, or every product that's kind of completely marked up. Another major issue we're dealing with right now is concrete. Concrete suppliers, major concrete suppliers, are on strike. So if you're in the midst of a major project right now, you're basically shut down waiting for concrete. I think it affects something like 35% of the concrete in the Lower Mainland. And construction is, it's all about concrete. Yeah, there's a lot of wood frame, but even wood frame buildings need foundations and stuff. So it's just one thing after the other. And if it's, if the concrete strike ends next month, it's going to be something else. These things are not slowing down. They're going to keep happening with our current economy. So yeah, construction costs. And I think the other thing to note is, unlike the real estate market, which in our case might soften, which it looks like is happening currently, construction costs, at least for now, I don't think they're gonna have the same softening, because once they're sort of built into the cost and built in the economy, and workers have received higher wages and inflation, those costs are there for good, basically, and that's your benchmark cost moving forward. So in terms of construction costs, that's our kind of baseline level, whatever we're dealing with today, and we just have to hope that wages and profit and everything increases to hopefully offset construction costs.
Do economies of scale force these projects to become larger in terms of the overall size of the development? You talked about the cost of land, the cost of building materials. Presumably, if you add more units, you're able to offset some of those hard costs. Have we no other choice but to just build bigger?
Avi can speak to this, but one of the ironies is that if I was to build a 1,500 square foot apartment, the cost per square foot is probably lower than the cost per square foot of a 600 square foot apartment, because there's still bathrooms and kitchens and certain costs. There's one electrical panel for both size homes and so forth. But for other reasons, we all seem to be building smaller and smaller homes. And that's because of those other considerations that I mentioned, including The bank may require you to pre-sell a certain number of apartments before you get financing to build the building. And Bob Rennie, who you mentioned before, will say it's much easier for me to pre-sell a studio or small one-bedroom apartment on a Saturday afternoon than a 1,500 square foot 3-bedroom apartment that might be more suitable for what we call an end user, somebody who's actually going to live in the unit rather than simply buy it and rent it out. So, but on terms of scale, I think Avi can comment better than I. My experience building small projects is that they tend to be a lot more expensive in many respects than building a larger project where you still have one superintendent and a different level of staffing.
Avi, every time, so the people talk about the fact that where houses are so much larger than they used to be. I know that that's partly a choice, but is it partly economics as well?
Yeah, I mean, houses or homes, it depends what you're talking about.
Sure.
So if you're talking about, yeah, it just depends what your reference point is. I mean, if you're talking about out in the suburbs, sure, yeah, maybe people are building larger houses, and so that's one of the reasons they cost more. But if you're looking at a square foot base, like comparing 1,000 square foot house 40 years ago to 1,000 square foot house today and accounting for inflation, I mean, it's multiple, it's exponentially more expensive to build a house today. And I mean, there's good reason for that. Like the houses today are better built and more environmentally friendly, energy efficiency, fire protection, all that stuff. But I think there's just a lot of sort of bureaucracy that we sort of have to get through that actually don't add any benefit, and they add a lot of cost. And I think I did put out a tweet there on social media about just taxes and fees when it comes to building and development, and it was with respect to a single family house. And there's a lot of kind of information out there, but I just really wanted to dial it down. And basically, if you, for a single family house in the city of Vancouver, it works out to about 15%. Now, it depends what you consider taxes and fees and that sort of thing, but it works out to roughly about 15% for a single family house goes to taxes and fees. And for larger developments, now I don't work in those spaces, but it is more because you're paying more for community amenity contributions, DCLs, there's more consultants, it's more complex. So in terms of tax and fees, it's more. And today at City Council in Vancouver, they're actually debating DCL costs. But one of the graphics I put out there was the true difference between the DCL fees in constructing a single family house compared to multifamily. And multifamily is it's like 3 or 4 times as much in the city of Vancouver. And I think people might say, well, we're just going to stick it to these greedy developers and we're going to make them pay for these DCLs. They have lots of money, but that's not how it works. I mean, these costs just get passed on the consumer. And when you're building a multifamily building, that consumer is a young person or an immigrant or a working or middle class person. So what ends up happening with a lot of these fees that are being charged to large scale developers is it's the end consumer that pays, and some with limited means that's ended up paying for all these extra taxes and fees.
So one of the solutions that started to got traction in the last decade or so is the development of more purpose-built rental with heavy incentives from local government. As we know that there were federal incentives to build rental housing prior to the 1980s, but that fell off for almost a generation. Just as a little bit of a background, when I was serving on the Vancouver City Planning Commission with Seti Pendiker and Bob Ransford and Alan Boniface and Eddie Yan and a whole bunch of really great folks, Frank Ducote, we ended up talking, it was actually Seti's idea of trying to create some municipal incentive where we bonus density that would be translated into purpose-built rental. We thought it was a crazy idea at the time, but wrote a little paper. And of course, the following Vision Council took that idea. They created the STIR program, the Rental 100 program. And so now this has become a model that really took hold. However, it's been struggling lately. And Michael, you tweeted out about a conversation that was held among some of your peers in a golf club locker room, saying that they're walking back from the rental development. Can we talk a minute about the future of rental right now and where it stands?
So you're quite right. 50 years ago, there was a lot of money coming into the construction of rental housing because the federal government had a program whereby doctors and dentists, if they invested in a rental property, they could get capital cost depreciation, which they could offset against their other income. And so lots of people were investing in the construction of rental buildings. And those are all those plain, simple buildings we see up and down Cambie Street and throughout many parts of the city. That stopped in part because it was too successful and it was costing the federal government too much money. But then in the late 70s, because there was a need for more money to go into rental construction, a program called the MERB program, multiple unit residential building, was created, which again gave write-offs to doctors and dentists and lawyers and others who would invest in rental. And those programs went on until about 1982. Federal government had other programs, but eventually they declined. And then for literally decades, most developers stopped building any rental housing. And you're quite right. The initiative that you and others created resulted in new programs such that in the last couple of years in the city of Vancouver, especially, we have seen a lot of what we call purpose-built rental. In other words, these aren't condos that are rented out. These are buildings that are 100% rental and will be in perpetuity. And they were working. They were working because the interest rates were like 2%, 2.5%. Construction costs were manageable. The city was giving density bonuses so that you could build a larger building, and they in fact became so popular that the city said, you know what, we should try and get a percentage of these rental apartments at below market rent. And then so a new program was created by the current council, and to its credit, it too was very successful, although I did argue that sometimes the rents were lower on the affordable units because the units were so bloody tiny. In fact, the city even established some lower size thresholds. But what has happened, and it's happened almost in the last 6 months, is as interest rates have risen, and as Avi has pointed out, as construction costs have risen, many of the projects that got approval, even with density bonuses, and the promise of 20% below market rentals, they're no longer financially viable. And so the developers that I know, who I meet in the locker room as we're standing naked, wrapped in a white towel, an image most people don't even want to think about, those projects are on hold. And it's going to be a problem. And one of the things I've suggested is, yes, you can increase the density, you can keep increasing the density, but you could eventually get to the point, Mike, where the land could be free. But if the interest rates are so high and the construction costs are so high and the approval process is so long, those projects cannot be economically viable at rents that people can afford, even if the land is free. And so we have to rethink how we do it. And to my mind, the answer is we need to bring the federal and provincial governments back into the picture, not just to incent doctors and dentists to invest, but to help nonprofits create more affordable homes that are truly available for those in greatest need.
Avi, as somebody who's in the business, do you think the model is changing as we speak, and where do you think it has to go?
Well, I think there's definitely a political and social shift towards densification and rentals and the yes in my backyard mentality. I think the yes in my backyard mentality has started to become less partisan. So there's a lot of very right-wing and left-wing people that are very pro-density right now. And just sort of reading news articles from other cities around North America, I think there's really a major shift in, let's say, a place like San Francisco or other municipalities or Toronto that have kind of similar types of problems. That, yeah, we're really going to see a huge shift towards densification in cities. Whether you agree with it or not, that's up to the individual, but I really do see that shift for sure.
I want to keep going on that hopeful tone. Michael, give us some positive understanding of where things can go from here.
So I have expressed concern about the Broadway corridor, not because I'm opposed to densification. On the contrary, I've spent my entire life seeking approval for taller buildings and higher density buildings, apartments and single family neighborhoods along Oak Street or West 41st. I'm generally in favor of all of these. My concerns have been degree, but many people have said to me, just second, Geller, we've got to accommodate a lot of people who are moving into this region. And if we don't approve high density along Broadway, where are we going to put them? Well, I have answers. One of the things that I do advocate, and Avi can participate in this, is making better use of all the single family lots. In simplistic terms, we subdivide the 50-foot lots in 25-foot lots. And then instead of having one home, you have 3 homes or 4 homes. So you begin to do townhouses and stacked townhouses, one townhouse above another. There's a whole range of housing forms that could fit in with single family neighborhoods, to my mind, without resorting to the proposals that I see, including one on West 49th right now, where somebody wants to put a 6-story box in amongst all those lovely old character houses. And I have a problem with that, but I don't have a problem with a small apartment building that's designed to fit in. The other thing that I do see is the potential to make better use of the arterial streets, but not just high rise, what you refer to and others as the missing middle forms of housing. And I think there's a lot we can do there. We can also then look at what I call the transition zones, the blocks behind the arterials, between that and the more expansive single family neighborhoods. So maybe you have 6 stories along the arterial, and then you have 4 stories in the transition zone, and then you do 2 and 3 stories in the single family with a broader mix. We can also mix in some shops and commercial businesses in some of these single family neighborhoods, like we used to do in the past. So there are opportunities. Finally, the other thing I think we can do is look at some of the lands not currently zoned for housing. David Lay wrote an op-ed yesterday in the Vancouver Sun that I subscribe to entirely, where he said, why don't we look at some of the light industrial and employment lands and introduce housing? Because the fact is, industry today is not that noxious, smelly stuff of yesteryear. Industry today is high-tech office space. So there's many opportunities, to my mind, to make better use of the land we already have without feeling we have to go to 10 floor space ratio, 40-story towers in a lot of areas which are right up against 2- and 3-story houses.
Avi, what's the positive future based upon the people you talk to, either your customers, your colleagues? What can we be doing better to make housing more affordable and accessible to people in Vancouver?
For me personally, I think we should go after the low-hanging fruit, and what I've seen is and that's been the thing I've sort of pushed on social media and also advocate on at council, is just approval times. I mean, yeah, everybody's got great ideas about what types of housing we should build, and I'm pro-development, so I support everything really. But when you look at the costs of bureaucracy, and nobody really quantifies that, that's why I wanted to quantify it, because in the time it takes to develop a project, you have all those holding costs and transaction costs and all this stuff, but you also have the capital appreciation of that land as well. And whoever is the end user, be it a renter or purchaser, whoever, that person has to end up paying that higher cost. And if you take the example of, let's say, constructing a single family house in the city of Vancouver, so a lot of houses are taking about a year to get through City Hall. Not all, but a lot. A good, probably like 30 to 40% are taking 12 months just to get through City Hall. And, you know, another 12 months to build. So if you just sort of sit back and think about the economic cost of sitting there doing nothing for 12 months, when that builder could be, I don't know, building another house in that 12 months, because the actual time it takes to process a permit when it comes to staff hours, and I sort of just learned this recently, you're talking about like a matter of hours. It's like, you know, 5 or 6 hours worth of staff of a plan checker sitting down and looking at the application. So theoretically, the application should, you know, could only take a day or two. But the economic costs of this long queue that we have that we can't seem to sort out, you know, in 12 months, theoretically, we could be building twice as much housing. Builders would be happy because, you know, there's less risk in holding the land and they like to build, and developers doing larger developments would be happy because they can, you know, their approvals are they're twice as long. You know, it takes minimum 2 years to get a multi-family project through the city of Vancouver. So I think for me, it's really, we need to look at this low-hanging fruit that is really a solvable problem, and I think that's permit wait times and the bureaucracy at the municipal level.
I feel as though there's a contradiction, and I, at the risk, because I'm sure that some of the public servants that are behind the permitting process in the city of Vancouver are feeling fairly beat up these days because of the public rancor that exists out there. But obviously, we need to support them in some way, because I'm sure many of them have some terrific ideas on how to streamline and make it go more smoothly. And it's having that political will, part of it, and also just having a plan, having the leadership to make it happen. Michael, any sort of final thoughts? And I'm just going to add one sort of tidbit. We talked a bit about rental. Is the shift going to be going back to the condo, the ownership model, do you think? And is that part of the solution? I'll let you sort of finish up.
On your first question, there is a solution. We have a program in many municipalities called the Certified Professional Program. In other words, you simply don't expect the city staff, the plan checkers, to review carefully everything. You have a third party, a professional, let them review it and certify that they're satisfied that that design meets the zoning and the building code and so forth. And whenever I've suggested, why don't we make better use of certified professionals, it's because people have said to me, well, the unions won't allow it because eventually you may suddenly not need as many staff at City Hall. But certainly making better use of certified professionals is one way to address the very acute problem that Avi so well described. In terms of, are we going to see more condo projects become rental projects? It's so interesting, Mike, because recently we did see condo projects becoming rental, and I think it may well be a matter of time before those same projects revert to becoming condos. And I told the story at the Urban Development Institute 50th anniversary that I am so old that I once was hired to rezone some industrial property in Richmond into residential lots. And 2 years later, the residential market had changed. And I was asked by the same owner to go back and see if I could rezone it from residential back to industrial, because industrial was worth more. The point is, and Avi hinted at this, markets are constantly changing. And when projects take too long, you actually completely miss the market. Google my name and you'll see an article about a desperate developer trying to sell a heritage house in West Vancouver because it took an extra 6 months to build. And during that time, the government introduced the foreign buyers tax, the speculation and vacancy tax, and it completely changed the economics of the project from when we first started it. So I want to echo what Avi said. Yes, we can talk about innovative housing forms, we can talk about other ideas, but if we could simply reduce the amount of time it takes to approve projects significantly, that would be a tremendous benefit for everyone.
So what I'm hearing is the need for speed. So thank you, Michael. Thank you, Avi. Great conversation. I know we could probably go for another hour easily and tear this subject apart, but I contacted you on short notice. You both agreed to come on. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast and sharing your ideas, and look forward to sort of seeing more of your commentary, thoughtful commentary through your social channels. You're at Michael Geller and at East Van Builder on Twitter. So thank you very much, and we'll look forward to continuing this great conversation. Bye for now.
Thanks.
Thank you.